property. All right, this is microeconomics, and we are talking about monopolies today in Chapter 15. Well, you'll recall from Chapter 14 we were talking about perfectly competitive firms. Probably the easiest example to think of for a competitive firm is a firm that's making an agricultural product, like apples or oranges. It doesn't matter what brand of an orange you buy, it's pretty much going to taste the same as any other orange. You or I could go to a nursery, we could buy a Gala apple tree. And I saw at the nursery out in the Woodway area, they're $25, less than $30. You can buy an apple tree or a plum tree. You can just plant in your backyard, and very little barriers to entry, right? As long as you've got $25 and you've got water to water that plant, you can start producing apples. And your apple that is going to come from that tree is going to be really similar to any apple that anybody can buy in at H-E-B. It's a pretty standardized, homogeneous product, and that's because an apple is an apple, and you're going to be a price taker. So whatever the price the market has determined for the apple is pretty much what you're going to get. Now we're talking about monopolies, completely different, completely the other end of the spectrum is what I'm trying to say. So by definition, they're the only seller of a product without close substitutes. Okay, instead of a price taker, again, because you have a product that anybody else could, it's really easy for someone else to copy. Now you're a price maker if you are a firm in a monopolistic, or if you're a monopolistic firm. You're able to have some control over the price. And this doesn't mean that you can charge whatever you want, because firms are always still constrained by a downward sloping demand curve, right? We have one zoo here in town, right? The Cameron Park Zoo, but they can't charge $200 to get in. That doesn't mean that they can charge whatever they want. They have a lot of control over the price, and that's what we mean by price maker. It's just they can't charge whatever they want. And because they're the only seller of a product, there have to be high barriers to entry to stop competitors from coming in. And there are lots of reasons why. How many of y'all have gone to see the new Superman movie already? Okay, some of us. It's pretty good. My friends were really concerned that it was going to be sold out, and so I went early and got tickets for everybody. Somebody was going to meet us at Hollywood Jewel, and I remember sitting there, and since I was there early, I thought maybe I should get something to eat. And I looked at the prices for bottled water. How much is water at the movie theater? Higher than that. I mean, I thought there was something wrong with my vision. It's $5.50 for water at Hollywood Jewel. And it's a bigger bottle of water, but still, $5. I said, I have time to go run to Whataburger and I can get some ice water, and I'll be back in time before my friends get here. But, okay, you're not supposed to bring other food or drink in there, right? That's the only place that you can get a drink if you want to get a drink during that 2 or 3 hours that you're watching your movie. So they have a little more control over the price of that bottles of water. And their barrier of entry, of course, is their rule that you can't bring in other food or drink. Okay, well, we're going to talk about those 3 barriers of entry in more detail. Those 3 sources. And these are things that stop competitors from coming in. And the first one is monopoly resources. So you might think of professional sports leagues. If they have contracts with all of those really, really good, those key players, those best players in a city, they've got control over those players, right? Or if you have a really, really big stadium, that's going to prevent another league from forming if you've got that key resource. Alcoa, up until the 40s, owned that specific mineral that you need to make aluminum and they own most of it. So that's another example of a key resource being, or it could be a specific technology. Poinsettias, if you've bought those at Christmas time to decorate, a family in California actually, they kept it a secret. They didn't patent it, but they knew that if you could graft two different types of plants together, there would be a lot more leaves and it would be really pretty and red. So for a long time, they were the ones who grew, that family grew those pretty poinsettias until it was actually a university researcher. They published in the journal. They discovered that also, that you could graft these two plants together and there'd be more stems on each branch. And so they weren't a monopoly after that, after people figured out how to produce that pretty plant. Okay, the second barrier of entry is government regulation. Okay, it takes a long time, do lots of testing to make a pharmaceutical product, right? A drug that we can take, some medicine. And so it takes more than a decade probably. So once you get that patented, 20 years, you're the only person who can make that drug, or you're the only company that can produce that product. So after 20 years, generic drugs can come in and copy you. But up until then, you've got 20 years, and that's a profit incentive, right? Hopefully you are going to protect that idea, and that's an incentive for researchers to come up with new medicines and new drugs. If you write a book or produce a movie, produce some music, again, you want that protection that no one's going to be able to copy your stuff. And that's government created, because the government's allowing you to have some legal recourse in case someone does copy you. And you'll be the only person who can produce and sell your own music or your book. So you can see we have sometimes there's a reason for it, sometimes it's just the way it is. Somebody's got ownership of a key resource, but they will lead to higher profits for monopolists and higher prices overall as compared to competitive markets. There's still another one. A third barrier to entry is the production process itself. And usually, we've talked about natural monopolies before. Here's the definition again. A single firm can provide a service or supply a good to an entire market cheaper than if we had several different firms. So think of my apartment when they were installing all those cables in the ground for the cable TV. It's easier to let just Time Warner do it, one company do it, rather than a whole bunch of different companies coming in and digging up the ground. It's easier to have Waco Water have one sewage system set up for the entire city, rather than having a bunch of different companies come in and, have different sewer systems. It just doesn't make sense that way. So whenever you've got really, really big fixed costs, like digging into the ground or setting up pipes for an entire sewage system for a city, it makes sense for one company to do it because they've got those economies of scale. And we've talked about this before. As your company gets bigger and bigger, as you're producing more, we'll see costs start to go down, right? Now, in the very long run, we might see costs go back up, but for this part, before it starts to go back up and we start to see diseconomies of scale, this is the part. If the company is still operating on this portion of the average total cost curve, and they're still experiencing those economies of scale. Okay, so those are some reasons why monopolies arise, and they can stay the only seller of that product and have a lot of control over the price. And you recall from the previous chapter, demand for a single competitive firm. Remember, the market demand is still always downward sloping, but if you're a competitive firm, homogeneous product, no barriers to entry, people can easily copy you, you're a price taker, and you're only going to be able to sell at that one price. You can sell more if you want, but you're still going to be constrained by that price, and that's independently determined by the market. For a monopolist, for a single firm and for the market, they have a downward sloping demand curve. So it's a little bit different when we're looking at the graph. For monopolists now, we're back to our downward sloping regular demand curve. And we'll keep that in mind as we're talking about marginal revenue, calculating those numbers, and then actually looking at the graph too. You'll remember that revenue is equal to price times quantity as usual. Average revenue, we calculated these numbers before, would just be regular revenue divided by quantity. So that's the formula for that. Marginal revenue, remember we were looking at marginal product or marginal cost. You're looking at the difference between the regular cost of each additional unit. Or when we had our firm over here, DeMarcus was our first person. Can't remember who our second person was. Was it Brandon? Or maybe Dan? We were looking at how much additional little piece of paper that was stapled were produced when we added one more person in. So that's what marginal means when we're looking at the next additional unit. Okay, for a monopolist, marginal revenue is always less than the price. For a competitive firm, these were equal. It's because we had that horizontal demand curve. It was just one price always. But for a monopolist, the marginal revenue is going to be lower because they're constrained by that downward sloping demand curve. If they want to sell more, they're going to have to lower the price for each additional unit that they're going to sell. They can't sell at just one price like a competitive firm had to. So let's look at some numbers here. And y'all know how to calculate these already, but these are just some example numbers. So we've got gallons of water. And here's the price that they can sell each gallon of water at. So if they were going to sell at $11, nobody's going to buy any. At $10, one person. But 1 gallon of water is going to be sold. If they want to sell more, they're going to have to lower the price because of the downward sloping demand curve. Okay, total revenue, y'all know how to get that. Average revenue is just regular total revenue divided by quantity. So this column divided by this column. And then marginal revenue, we're just taking the difference here. So where did they get that 8? 18 minus 10. Divided by the change of quantity, it's just going to be 1 in the denominator. Where did they get that 6? 24 minus 18. Where did they get that 4? 28 minus 4. Divided by 1, obviously. So you can see that when you do the math, marginal revenue is less than the price. What your author was saying on the previous slide. So when a monopolist tries to sell more items, they're going to see two effects on total revenue. First of all, they're going to be able to increase total revenue, which will, with the output effect, so total revenue will tend to increase, but then they also have to think about the price effect. So they're going to have to lower the price every single time because they're constrained by a downward sloping demand curve, and that tends to decrease total revenue. So before we didn't have this when we were talking about competitive firms. Monopolists have to think about both of these. And so their marginal revenue curve actually bisects the demand curve. It's going to be lower than what consumers are willing and able to buy. Now you will remember the stuff on this slide. If the marginal revenue of the product is greater than the cost of it, you should go ahead and make more, right? Once it costs you to make more, it costs you more to make that product than versus the marginal revenue you're going to make on it, then it doesn't make sense to keep producing. And remember, the golden rule of profit maximization is to produce, you're going to maximize profit where marginal revenue equals marginal costs. Remember, Michael was saying that for some other firms in town, they'll tell potential clients, or customers, no, we can't, we don't go out for just a few hours at a time. And that's because the money that they're going to make off of those few hours of home care is going to be greater than what it's going to cost for them to pay their employee, right? And so it's, how did Michael capture, that part of the market that other companies are saying no to? He's charging a little bit more, so he's getting more marginal revenue there, so he can get those customers that other people are saying no to. If you see a graph like this on the quiz or the test, you should immediately think, we're not talking about perfect competition anymore. So remember, for a perfectly competitive firm, this marginal revenue curve was straight across here. Remember? So now we've got a marginal revenue curve that bisects the demand curve, so you should think, okay, we're talking about a competitive or monopolistic firm in this case. Okay, golden rule of profit maximization is where what equals what?
MCMR.
Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay, so here's marginal cost, here's marginal revenue. Find where they're equal. If I ask you, at what quantity should this monopolistic firm produce at to maximize revenue, you're going to find that intersection and you go straight down. And that's the quantity that they're going to produce at to maximize revenue. If I ask you what price are they going to produce at, okay, go back to where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but you can't go straight out like you did with the competitive firm. You have to go straight up all the way. They're going to charge as much as customers are willing and able to pay. So they're going to charge this price. This is the monopoly price. Okay, so first step, find where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. To find profit maximizing quantity, go straight down. To find profit maximizing price for a monopolist, you go all the way up and make sure you hit the demand curve. Then you can find the monopoly price. You'll recall the definition of profit is total revenue minus total costs, right? So we're going to find the area that's above total cost. So what we were doing, finding that point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, you go down to find quantity, you go up to find the price, and then you just take the area above total costs. So we're still on this line here. You see where it hits average total cost? That's where you stop. And so this whole area would be revenue, but the area above costs would be just the profit. So as long as those costs are below the price, they'll still make a profit. If the average total cost curve was way up here, they would be operating at a loss. There was a case study in the book about pharmaceutical drugs. So we said, if you are able to patent your product, your medicine, 20 years, you're the only person who can produce that drug. So nobody can copy you, no other generic drugs can come in. So, and he said, for a typical drug company, the marginal cost is relatively constant. So I know usually it's sloping upward, but he said for a drug company, it's usually like this. So marginal cost equals marginal revenue, right there. What's the quantity that this monopolist is going to produce at to maximize profit? Straight down. What price are they going to charge? It goes all the way up to the demand curve. That's the price that a monopolist is going to charge as long as they've got their patent. Okay, as soon as the patent expires, those generic drugs are ready, right? Those people, if you're going to be producing a generic drug, you're ready to have that to be shipped out to the manufacturers. So if you have a drug and you've got 12 different generic brands for it, what's going to happen to the price? How many people have gone to Walmart and have gotten a generic drug for $5? Okay, a lot of us. So what's going to happen? After that patent expires, we're going to see the price go back down, closer and closer to the marginal cost. And once, if we happen to get all the way back down here, more people are going to be able to afford that drug at lower prices. Although, I think your author mentioned this in the book too, that's assuming that people think that a generic drug, chemically it's the same, but sometimes people are loyal to the brand name, and they said even for Prozac, its patent expired way back in 2001, but some people thought that the generic isn't the same thing or doesn't work as well for whatever reason, and so they were still loyal to buying Prozac, so they were able to still make some profits long after 2001. Okay, we've seen this before, and you all know the DMAC curve shows the willingness and ability of buyers and consumers to purchase a product at different prices, and so that shows the value to them. And then you can think of the marginal cost curve as a supply curve representing different costs to firms. So when we have a monopolist that's going to charge monopoly prices and produce at this quantity, what has happened? They could have sold more. The value to consumers here for that product is still greater than the cost of production, but if they're going to maximize profit, they're going to cut off the market right here and produce this much and charge this much. So what happens? We've got some people left out, right, who would have bought that drug or that item, whatever, that we're talking about if the price was lower. But are they going to get it? No, because here's where the market's cut off, and just like we've seen before with this big triangle, when we cut out part of the market, we've got a deadweight loss here. So looking at it from, big picture, when we have monopolists who restrict the quantity that's produced and charge higher prices, there are some people who are left out. There's consumer surplus that's left out. They would have paid maybe a little bit less for that product. But since the monopolist is charging one price and only one price, $5.50 for a bottle of water at the movie theater, if I was thirsty enough, I would have paid $3 for it. I'm sure other people would have too. And so, but if they're only charging $5.50, they're losing out on these other sales, right? And these people are not getting any bottles of water because they're not willing to pay the $5.50 for it. So that's what we mean with a deadweight loss. Let me come back over here. If a monopolist is smart, they can transform some of these deadweight losses into profit. So instead of just wherever the average total cost curve is, instead of just this part as profit, they can capture some of this by charging a little bit lower prices to some people. So for most people, they'll charge this price, but for some people, they can charge a little bit lower. And it only works in certain situations, but that's called price discrimination. If they're able to sell the same product at different prices, they can transform some of those deadweight losses into profit. All right. Cameron Park Zoo. Who's gone before? It's really nice zoo, right? How much does it cost to get in?
It was like $10 or something like that.
Yeah, it's $9. So, does everybody have to pay $9? Okay, who gets to pay a little bit lower price?
That's children.
Okay, children.
Yeah. Groups.
Uh,
I think you get a group discount.
okay, group discount. Who else do they give discounts to?
Probably seniors.
Seniors.
Members of certain societies.
I know that there's Zoological Society gets paid.
Well, yeah, I think
I don't know
that
if that counts though.
I think if you are a member of a certain group of another zoo and they partner with Cameron Park Zoo, you can get in for a lower price. I think there's a military discount. So y'all are familiar with this practice already. You can get a discount. So what are they doing? Instead of just selling at $9 as a flat rate for everybody, they're capturing a little bit more of this dead weight loss by selling, I can't remember exactly, but let's just pretend it's $7 for seniors and then $6 for kids. And they can capture some of that as profit.
Movie theaters do it with students, right? That's why they do that.
Mm-hmm. So it is a rational strategy. You're able to charge a customer a price closer to his or her willingness to pay. So we know that students, if are willing to pay a little bit less than the regular $7.25 that it takes to get into the movie theater. If you show your ID, you can get in for $5, and you can sell more than is possible than just with one single flat rate. But in order for this to work, you have to do a couple of things. You have to be able to prove that someone actually is a senior, right? You have to show some, maybe your driver's license. You have to prove that you're a student by showing your student ID. Also, you have to make sure that you can't resell the product. Now, I said that, I might have paid $3 for a big bottle of water at the movie theater, but what's to stop me from going outside and then reselling that for maybe $4? See, for an actual product that I can hold and resell, they have to worry about arbitrage if they're going to do that. But at the zoo, there's no ticket stub or anything. You just pay and you go in, right? There's no way to resell your discount if you were a senior and gone in at a discounted price. So there's no chance to resell that product or service. And so arbitrage is when you can. So price discrimination only works, your author is saying, is when you can't. Don't have an opportunity for arbitrage. And then overall, what can we say about price discrimination? We can eliminate some of that dead weight loss. More consumers can go to the zoo, go to the movies, or get into, to see a game. You all know or a concert, different tickets have different prices based on how close you are. And they can transform some of that dead weight loss into profit. If a monopolist were able to somehow know everybody's willingness to pay and charge each customer a different price, then they would be able to capture all of that dead weight loss. There's still going to be some, but in real life. But your author's saying if they were able to perfectly price discriminate and capture all of that dead weight loss, then that would be perfect. But without it, if they're just charging one single rate, then they lose out on some profit, and we are losing out on some consumer surplus too. A little bit for my graphics to come up here. In figure 9, you can see in panel A, this would be the monopolist's profit. Here's the consumer surplus. So for those people who think that they would have valued going to the Cameron Park Zoo for $15, but they only had to pay $9, they're going to have some consumer surplus left over. So that's this blue box. Here's the dead weight loss if they were to only charge $9 or one flat rate, and the market would stop right there. That's how many people would be able to get into the zoo. But if they were able to perfectly price discriminate and know everybody's willingness to pay and charge exactly that amount, they could capture all of that. They could capture the people who wanted to pay $15 or were willing and able to pay $15 and turn that consumer surplus into profit.
Is there a term excessively complicated of a question.
No, that's just, yeah, it's just,
Trial and error.
yeah, it would just be perfect price discrimination overall. Okay, and here are some other examples in other industries that y'all have seen price discrimination before. You just didn't know what it was called. Right. Well, in terms of public policy, how can the government respond to monopolists in different ways? Well, the government, our Department of Justice does this today. Why were AT&T and T-Mobile not allowed to merge? Why are other companies allowed to merge? Well, it comes back to certain rules or certain laws that we have. The Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted in 1890, and this allows the government to step in and reduce the market power of big companies or trusts. And this was actually enacted in response to a lot of public resentment about Rockefeller owning Standard Oil. And what he would do is if he saw another oil company, he saw some competition, he would buy them out and then shut them down. If you saw someone else who was competing with him, buy them out, shut them down. And so he owned a lot of the oil. So because of the Sherman Antitrust Act, that gave the power to the government to come in and say, you're too big, we're going to split you up into a bunch of different companies. And that's why we've got Chevron and Exxon and BP. We've got a lot of different companies now. So this act gave the government the power to do that. Another act is the Clayton Antitrust Act. And this further strengthened our government's powers, and it stops companies from having tying contracts, which means if you buy our cameras, like Kodak, you have to use Kodak film. I know we use our phones to take pictures now, but back when you used to need film for your camera, that's an example of a tie-in contract. Or Microsoft. Okay, what internet browser did they put and bundle in with their operating system if you bought their computers? Okay, Internet Explorer. And so our government said that's not giving. What's the name of the other?
Netscape.
Yes, Netscape. It's not giving Netscape a chance to compete. And so these acts give our government, specifically the Department of Justice, the power to prevent mergers and look at the market share. How much of the market are y'all going to have if you do merge, or to go ahead? And that's proactive, right? Or you're too big right now, we're going to break you up. That's post. That's changing the structure of a company to try to promote competition. Another option in terms of public policy is maybe not changing the structure or preventing a merger, but telling existing companies, what to do. Regulating the price. Now, we've talked about price controls before, and that sometimes they'll lead to other problems, even though the original intent was to try to help. And this is common in the case of natural monopolies. So you might think of the Postal Service, United States Postal Service, or Waco Water. It makes sense. It's cheaper for one company to go ahead and be in charge of all the sewage for a city. And so if the government's going to regulate the price, sometimes they don't think about the costs of operating that whatever we're talking about, that company. And so if there's a problem, if the price that the government has regulated is lower than the average total cost, then they're going to be operating at a loss. So what's the government going to have to do? They might have to subsidize to keep that company going and provide money for them. And then what incentive does that company have to reduce costs if they know the government's going to help them out? So that's going to lead to maybe some other problems and inefficiencies. So, graphical example, if that regulated price is below average total cost, then we've got a loss there. Another option in terms of public policy might be public ownership. So you don't just regulate it, don't tell them what to do, but actually take over, like the government did with the United States Postal Service. But economists prefer, instead of regulation, instead of the government taking over, economists would much rather prefer that we have private owners, because then you have an incentive to lower your costs and help better the production process. Because if the government does a bad job, who loses out? Customers and taxpayers. There's actually a fourth option that I don't have a slide for, and that's doing nothing. Doing nothing. The government can do nothing if there's a companies want to merge, and there's a Nobel Prize winning economist, Stigler, who says in your chapter that market failure, even if we do have companies that are getting too big, there's this argument, when is it too big? Did Microsoft have the right to go ahead? If it's such a good product, what's so wrong about them tying Explorer with their operating system? If it's a good product and consumers want it, what's wrong with that? Should the government come in and try to have them share code and things that they did afterwards to promote competition? He said market failure is much smaller than and not as bad as political failure when we have the government coming in. So again, we're going back to the argument of what's the proper role of the government in our economy, and we'll take a look at some examples of real life monopolies. But in reality, like I said, with purely competitive markets and with monopolies, it's really a matter of degree. Because, again, I didn't have to buy that water for $5.50. You don't have to go to the Cameron Park Zoo. That's not your only option. You could drive to Houston. You could drive to Dallas. But if we're just limiting it to Waco, yes, that's our one zoo here in town. So in reality, few goods and services are truly, truly unique, or they're only maybe protected for a certain period of time, like if you have a patent. And it's just, when we're talking about monopoly power, it's just to a matter of degree in real life. So that's the end of our notes